Poseidon. An alien sci-fi romance. Book 2 in the Colony Aqua series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. On a planet far from home, a solitary merman carved up corpses to sell to unsuspecting humans in the morning. The entrails were already in the bins out the back, waiting for the waste personnel to dispose of the evidence of tonight's carnage, because Sven was nothing if not efficient. He did like to take his time with the flesh though, slicing it up to make it as attractive as possible to a potential buyer. He shook his head. He didn't understand humans. Not at all. What could be attractive about a piece of dead flesh, usually hours or even days old, sometimes even frozen for who knew how long, instead of a live body that wreathed beneath you in its death throes as you decided it was the one that would have to die for your dinner? Gah, it was enough to make him hungry just thinking about it. He should finish up and head home, like the others had. He'd done plenty for today, and he could always do more tomorrow. A bang and a splash sounded from the front of the shop. "Hello," Sven called, lifting his knife so that blood ran down the blade onto his fingers, where it blended in with the rest. A splash, then the squeak of flesh hitting the side of a glass tank and being scraped along it. "Stop fighting. Bloody teenagers." Didn't matter what species, the males always seemed to want to fight. Even his kind, though it had been centuries since any of them had. Except for Halcyon, of course, but she was special. All kinds of special. And the reason he was in the back of the shop, late at night, hacking bits up instead of at home with his own people. He should be there, paying attention to one of the lovely girls who thought the leader of the mare community in the colony was important enough to spend time with. Instead of ignoring him for some human who could scarcely swim. With one savage blow, Sven severed another head and focused on slicing the finest fillets on New Hope. Perhaps in the whole Alton system. Humans just didn't deserve them. When Minali returned to the watch office, she was surprised to hear applause. Had someone broken the donut-eating record already? There wasn't a donut to be seen, but then there wouldn't be if someone had eaten them all, she reasoned. Lieutenant Diamond, her supervisor, appeared in front of her, holding out his hand. "Good going, Detective Mermen." He nearly crushed her fingers, he shook her hand so hard. "And Detective Small too. Biggest drug bust in the history of the colony." Diamond beamed. "And we all thought it was drones flying in somehow. Where did you get the idea they were using the prostitutes to bring it in?" Phil opened his mouth to reply, but Minali got in first. It was Phil. He thought of body cavity searches. "I didn't think it was a good idea at first." She grimaced as she remembered the terror on the girl's face when Phil had mentioned the search as a joke. What kind of prostitute was terrified of being penetrated? Either she'd made a very poor job choice or she had something to hide. Gambling on the latter, Minali had called Phil's bluff and insisted on the search. And hit pay dirt. But it never hurts to be thorough, so. Laughter echoed around the office. Minali was glad the girls couldn't hear it down in the cells. They'd be up on minor charges with a night or two in the cells and a fine, no more, but their boss would probably be shipped off planet to face the authorities on Elysium. Elysium had a zero-tolerance policy on drug dealers, and a dim view on sex slavery too. He wouldn't see daylight again for a long, long time. "It feels so good to wrap this case up, I'm going for a beer." "Who's with me?" Phil shouted. "To the moon and sixpence." A chorus of shouts told him half the office was up for a drink, it being a Friday night and all. "You coming, babe?" Phil asked Minali. She shook her head. "That report won't write itself." Phil laughed. "After a couple of beers, you bet it will. Come with us." "No." His smile faltered for a moment, before he hitched it back up. All right then, I'll have one for you. You better be home before I am though, 'cause that bed's sure cold without you. If anyone in the office hadn't known he was her partner in more than the professional sense, they did now. Whoops and catcalls followed his words as the mass exodus began, leaving only Minali behind. She slumped down at her desk, wishing she could one day meet a man, any man, whose life didn't involve drinking copious amounts of alcohol at the local pub. From her drunkard father to her equally inebriated ex-husband, her experience with alcohol only led to violence, anger and pain. Hers more often than not, and she bore the scars to prove it. Back before her dad had drunk himself to death and she'd showed up in hospital with a broken bottle embedded in her shoulder, courtesy of her loving ex-husband, she might have considered going for a drink. One drink couldn't hurt, right? But her shoulder ached, reminding her that it could. Sighing, she got to work. She'd rather write up the report anyway, closing this week with the successful end to a difficult case so she'd have a fresh assignment in the morning. She'd take anything that didn't involve body cavity searches of titans. She shuddered. Some of those creatures had fur or scales or more orifices than any being should have. Give her humans any day. At least they made sense biologically. The moon and sixpence thrummed with energy tonight, and it coursed through Bellina as readily as it did all the other bar patrons. Even the red-haired cook seemed to be affected by it, as she peeped hungrily through the serving window as if searching for someone. Bellina smiled, not needing to search. She had eyes for only one man, and he didn't know she existed. Maybe she'd work up the courage to change that tonight. She glided between patrons, wanting to be near him, even if he didn't look at her. She dodged around a watch officer who had a woman on each arm while he piggybacked a third, and almost bumped into him. She laid a hand on his arm to steady herself before she'd realized what she was doing. The contact was electric, holding her in place so she couldn't let go. An incubus on the other side of the bar, high on the energy in the room, did something to intensify it. A casual spark blazed into a raging bushfire of lust. His eyes turned on her, taking in her fingers on his arm before settling on her face. Impossibly, recognition flared in his eyes. "You," he cried, loud enough to be heard over the music. "The girl of my dreams. Come here." As if in a dream, Bellina felt his arms wrap around her, reeling her in closer so that her body pressed against his. She melted in his embrace, barely believing such a thing was possible. Then he pressed his lips against hers as he kissed her. Bellina reeled, lost in the sensation as he set her lips, her tongue and then her whole body afire. How could one body, no two, because they were so intertwined right now that he undoubtedly shared what she was feeling, contain so much emotion and energy without bursting? She couldn't, she was certain she couldn't. Breathless, panting, she pulled away from him. These feelings, these sensations were too heady for her. Too much for one night. Bellina stumbled through the crowd, intent on reaching the door and the cool night air outside. Her knees had gone strangely weak, so it felt like wading through neck-deep water as well as people. Yet she made it, nearly falling out the open door into the street. Bellina sucked in a deep breath, wondering if it was the first since he'd kissed her. Between her whirling head and her racing heartbeat, she could have happily slid to the ground and stared up at the dome above, just reliving that incredible kiss. "Wait!" She heard the shout from behind her and knew she couldn't stay here. Bellina bolted, not caring where her feet took her, as long as it was away. The patter of running feet behind her spurred her into going faster still. She couldn't seem to catch her breath, yet still she ran. Most of the shops here were shut, dark windows yawning like black holes on either side of her. She'd have dived into a black hole right now if it offered her an escape, but the shops were all dark and silent. All but one. The front of this shop was dark, true, but a light burned out the back in the office or the preparation area while someone worked late. She glimpsed glass tanks with something swimming inside. Bellina shoved at the door, which didn't budge. Growling, she reached up to wave at the motion sensor, and the door hissed open. She staggered inside, knowing that the blackness edging her vision had little to do with the darkness of simulated night. No, this was her body failing to retain consciousness after being pushed to the point of exhaustion. A familiar voice called out a greeting, and Belina nearly cried. Serendipity had led her to the one place she would be safe. The door hissed closed behind her, but Belina didn't notice. She grabbed for the nearest thing to help keep her upright, a waist-high fish tank with scuttling creatures on the bottom. Too late she realized that the top of the tank was open and her arms splashed into the water. A shadow loomed behind her. Belina was too tired to even turn her head to see. Arms caught her around the middle, tipping her headfirst into the tank. Belina panicked, trying to brace her arms against the glass walls, reaching desperately for the top to haul herself out, but all she did was slide down the slippery glass, unable to find any purchase. "Stop fighting," that familiar voice said, sounding far away. Too exhausted to argue, Belina complied, letting her body sink into the water. As her vision darkened, she thought she glimpsed a flash of fire before everything faded to black. Though her eyelids were so heavy they felt like they had lead weights attached to them, Minali worked doggedly at her report until it was complete. When she was certain she hadn't missed a single important detail, she saved it, sent it, and leaned back in her chair to rub her eyes. Phil swore he always needed a nightcap to help him sleep, but she could have slept upright in her chair. Better to sleep in a bed, if she could make it. She climbed wearily onto the speeder her rank as a detective entitled her to, blessing whichever colony designer had decided to make the vehicles self-driving, and programmed a course for Phil's apartment. She woke to the quiet chime of the speeder arriving at its destination, surprised that she'd dozed for the entire ride. She needed a day off. Several probably, and she'd more than earned it, what with all the overtime she'd pulled on this case. She'd check her calendar in the morning and see how much time she could take off before her next case. The corridor was empty as she palmed open the door to Phil's place, hoping he was back from the pub and still conscious. He might want to celebrate the end of a case with a drink, but she preferred a more intimate celebration in the privacy of the bedroom. The door hissed open and Minali's mouth dropped open too. Phil was home, but he wasn't alone. She counted no less than 4 women in the room with him, and none of them wore a scrap of clothing. Phil had one hand between one girl's legs while his other hand smacked another girl's bare butt. Every time he spanked her, the girl squealed out a number, like she was counting the blows. A third girl knelt in front of him, sucking on him like his nether regions were a lollipop, and the fourth girl had her head buried between the thighs of the third. The longer she looked, the more she saw. There was something otherworldly about each of the girls, whether it was the strange shimmer about them, the slightly off shade of their skin, or the unusual flexibility, that made Minali wonder if they were all some sort of shapeshifter. Titans and not human, she decided, feeling bile rise up in her throat. How could Phil cheat on her with 4 aliens, no less, on a night she'd counted on having him all to herself, without a case to distract them? "So you started celebrating without me," Minali said coldly. Phil finally noticed her. "Hey baby, I got lonely waiting for you." He extracted his hand from the first girl and wrapped his fingers around the third girl's ponytail, dragging her head away from him until his dick emerged from her mouth, moist and dripping from the girl's saliva. "Come give me some head. You suck better than this bitch." When the insulted girl tried to bite him with teeth turned suddenly to fangs, Phil slapped her face instead. Any desire Minali had felt drained away, to be replaced with cold fury. Not only had Phil cheated on her, but he was an abusive piece of trash like every other man she'd ever dated. "No Philibert, you suck," Minali said. "I hope your new friends drain you dry. And if you ever try to touch me again, I'll shoot you." She turned on her heel and walked out of his apartment and his life. If there was a man in the universe who didn't drink and would never hit a woman, Minali might date again. But who was she kidding? A man like that didn't exist. all men were assholes. She'd be better off alone, and good riddance to Phil and every other man like him. Who needed men anyway? They won't stop screwing around all night and they make so much noise I can't sleep, one mermaid shouted. She isn't taking care of her child properly. The baby cries all night, keeping us awake. If we can't sleep, what else are we supposed to do but have sex? The second girl fired back. Sven took a deep breath. It was barely daylight in the colony, but a leader's job hardly obeyed normal working hours. Besides, if he didn't deal with the girls' feud, no one would get any sleep. Melpomene, Melusine, I'll see what I can do about finding better accommodation for both of you. Perhaps if I moved Melusine to one of the apartments closer to the surface, little Thera wouldn't bother anyone so much when she cries. Once she starts sleeping through the night, you can always move back. Melpomene, Melusine isn't the only one who's commented on the noise. Perhaps if you and Theron could move to the pools, away from the sleeping cubicles, when you wish to be together, then you can make as much noise as you like without disturbing anyone's sleep. You're just jealous he likes me better than you. Melpomene hissed. You can have him, along with his limp dick and empty promises. Theron promised me he'd take care of Thera from the moment she was born, but instead of doing that, he's off screwing you. Melusine shot back. Sven knew he needed to have a word with Theron too. The two mermaids had been closer than sisters before he'd come between them. So close that everyone had thought the two were about to announce they'd make their partnership official, and yet they hadn't. Theron's messing with both of these friends' affections was disrupting their peaceful community more than he liked. Where's Theron? At work. He's opening the shop today, Melpomene said. Sven sighed. It was supposed to be his day off, but he'd have to go into the shop if he wanted any chance to speak to the merman privately. I'll see him this afternoon then. I'll speak to him then about, your concerns, ladies. And tell him to divide his time more evenly between the girls, or at the least fulfill his obligations with Thera, if he didn't like Melusine anymore. If Sven had children, he'd be the best father he could be. His thoughts darted to the other baby in the mare habitat, who was never the subject of a single complaint. Why, little Panacea was only a few weeks old, and her father was never far from her. Sven might not like the human, but he couldn't fault Galen as a father. If a human could face up to his responsibilities, Theron the merman had no excuse. Both girls thanked him and headed off in different directions. Sven let out a breath he hadn't even known he was holding. This leadership gig was harder than he'd thought it would be, but he wouldn't give it up for the world. He knew that before the day was over, things would be settled between Theron and his women, even if he had to hold Theron down and threaten to cut the man's balls off so he could give the girls one each to satisfy them. Mermaids were a bloodthirsty lot and no mistake. Tonight, there would be peace in the mare community, because nothing should disturb their idyllic life. Such was the privilege of being a mare. After her third coffee, Minali decided she was awake enough to listen to Phil's excuses, which turned into desperate protestations of his love for her. According to him, some titan had put an irresistible lust spell on him in the bar, and he had no idea how those women had arrived in his apartment. He'd woken up this morning with no memory of what he'd done with them, or why they were asleep with him in the same bed. When he'd started to complain about her absence among the pile of female flesh, he'd evidently woken the girls up, who started to voice their own complaints that Phil wasn't in bed with them. Minali had hung up on him. Some spell. Right. Wasn't his implant supposed to make him immune to such things? It didn't matter. Any man who struck a woman would never touch Minali. She was done with Phil. Instead of taking the day off like she'd planned, Minali decided to work her frustrations off in the office instead. Plenty of cases needed solving, and if she got her teeth into a really meaty one, she'd forget all about Phil and the titans who were no doubt gnawing on his manhood right now. Minali grinned at the vision of the fanged girl biting Phil's balls off. He deserved it, the cheating, beating prick. So you've heard already? Lieutenant Diamond asked as Minali strode into the office. Minali's grin faded. Heard what? She asked. Murder in Metropolis. No witnesses and no one knows the identity of the body. It's yours if you want it. A murder case might be a nice change after last week's drug bust, Minali decided. Most of the time, the perpetrator was a man, and she was definitely a man-hater this morning. I'll take it, Minali said. Good. You'll need a partner on this one, given it's a bit tricky, Diamond replied, not looking up from his tablet. Head over to Seafood Supply. Your partner's already there and can fill you in on the details. Minali fought down her disappointment that Phil had not only survived the night intact, but he'd beaten her to work on a particularly juicy case. On second thought, I'd like to take a break from working with a partner. Maybe a smaller case that I can take care of by myself. Or can't. I already promised Violet she could have you on this one. I want you to let her lead on it too. She's good at diplomacy and not even I know where she gets half her information sometimes, but I need my best detective on this, and she's not experienced enough. Seeing a small called in sick, you're the best I've got. The momentary pride Minali felt at being called the best, deflated at the thought of being second to Phil. She knew she was a better detective than him, but Diamond never saw it. She hoped Phil caught some horrible sexually transmitted disease from his Titan playmates that made his dick fall off. She swallowed her disappointment as she checked the address. I'll head over to the other side of Metropolis right away. While Minali's speeder zipped through the streets and tunnels of the colony, she pulled up a profile on Violet, her new partner. Try as she might, Minali couldn't remember any detective by that name. When she arrived outside a shop already shrouded in crime scene tape 15 minutes later, she still wasn't any the wiser. The woman had several commendations that came from the head of the watch himself, a man Minali had never met, but there was no information on how she'd earned them or even what cases she'd worked. Even her rank on the computer system put her as an ordinary constable, not a detective at all. Why then was she on a murder investigation and elevated to be Minali's partner? Minali looked harder at the other woman's profile, and spotted a tiny footnote at the bottom. The tiny print held just 2 words. Caution, succubus. All the pieces fell into place. Violet had seduced Diamond or perhaps someone even higher up to get the position she had. Not earned it the way Minali had, climbing her way up case by case in a department where women were few and far between. How dare the Titan woman sleep her way to the top, giving veracity to the stereotype that Minali and others had worked so hard to break. She'd probably been one of Phil's lovers last night too. Minali climbed stiffly off the speeder and marched up to the fraud known as Constable Violet Love. Violet's deep frown morphed into a beaming smile the moment she caught sight of Minali. Oh, thank the stars. I thought Diamond was going to saddle me with the lollipop man. You're such a sight for sore eyes I could almost kiss you. After work, maybe. In the meantime, can I call you Minnie? Minali's tone was so frosty it approached absolute zero. It's Detective Mermen to you, Constable. Violet didn't seem the slightest bit discouraged. Detective now, as of this morning, though I heard it might be a week before it's official on the computer system. But you can call me Violet. And I heard you let your last partner call you all sorts of nicknames. Seems only fitting that I get to too. She winked. Definitely one of Phil's lovers, Minali fumed. I don't care what gossip you've heard or who you've heard it from. If you think trading sex for information or promotion is better than getting there by working hard, you're in for a big surprise. I intend to solve this case without having to seduce anyone. Violet's eyebrows rose. Good for you, though it all sounds a bit rich coming from the lollipop man's latest sucker. The what? Violet laughed. While small's just as apt a description of the man, he's known as the lollipop man to most of us Titan girls. See, he's attracted to girls with power, which includes most Titans as well as assertive humans like you, I guess. He's no match for most of us, so he deals with his bruised ego by dating girls way better than he is. Once he's got you on your knees, he feels like a really big man. His sole goal in life is to make as many powerful women as possible lick him like a lollipop. It's no secret that he's awful in bed, so you wouldn't be the first to offer him a blowjob instead. Minali felt her face grown hot. Did you? Violet laughed again. No, I don't like lollipops. Instead, I like ladies. But I don't mix work and pleasure, so I'm afraid you'll have to find me after hours if you fancy an evening together. In the meantime, I believe we have a murder to solve. She turned to duck under the crime scene tape. Wait, Minali said, her thoughts whirling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Violet cut her off. Yeah, you did. You're not the first to think that sort of stuff about me, being a succubus and all. I might need sex to live, but I'm picky as hell about my partners. And I picked you for this case because you're the best, even if Diamond doesn't know it. So whatever issues you have with me, succubi or Titans in general, and let's get to work, eh? Minali nodded mutely. This was going to be a long day. She followed Violet through the doors. Minali stopped in surprise when she saw the interior of the shop. She was surrounded by glass, and on the other side of the glass were fish, she said weakly. Fish as small as her finger right up to fish as long as her leg, filling giant aquariums like nothing she'd ever seen before. What sort of shop was this? Seafood supply. You'd hope they have fish, Violet said. Usually, they have a big display of juicy fillets over there. She pointed at an angled display case, also made of glass, that was currently empty. But they won't risk spoiling the goods until we clear the crime scene and let them open for business again. Which we'll have done by noon. Violet cast a dark glance around the shop, which seemed to contain an inordinately large number of people for a forensic team. Minali did a head count, and came up with double the normal number. She'd struggled to get one team out to the last murder investigation she'd worked on. How did a newly promoted detective manage to get twice that, without having to sleep with half the watch force? Violet seemed to be reading her thoughts. You're not used to working with Titans, are you, Minnie? The nickname set her teeth on edge, but Minali let it go this once. What is this place? It's a fish shop. Freshest fish in Alton, or so they say. And I'm not going to argue considering who owns the place, Violet said. Realization dawned on Minali. It wasn't the strings Violet had pulled, but the pull of the shop's owner. Minali pressed her lips together. She didn't care who owned this place. If they were trying to cover up a murder, they'd soon discover they'd made a terrible mistake. No one was immune to justice, especially not when she was the officer on the case. And she'd team up with the devil himself to solve this. Where's the body? Minali asked. Violet pointed. In the tank. Minali's gaze followed Violet's finger, and her jaw dropped. Not one body but two floated in the water. Two women. No one killed women in her city and got away with it, Minali swore. Not now, not ever. One of the women moved, and Minali's eyes widened. At first glance, she'd looked like a woman, but that was only the top half of her. The other half. Why is there a mermaid swimming in my crime scene? Minali demanded. Mermaids didn't exist. Couldn't exist. She's fishing out the crabs so the boys can get to the body, Violet said, barely glancing at the tank. If she leaves those scavengers in there, there won't be any body left to autopsy. Minali took a moment to process this. Mermaids are real, she said slowly. And they're out here in space? Mermaids in space. You better believe it, Violet replied. Most dangerous titan you'll ever meet. And as they own this place, you'd better not forget it. No one holds a grudge quite like a mare. So you didn't see anything until you came in this morning, and found the body in the fish tank? Minali repeated. Theron shook his head. I left when the shop closed last night, just like Mel. We were home together last night. Making too much noise ourselves to hear anything else from the place next door, let alone a shop halfway across the colony. He winked. He'd probably lasted a grand total of 10 minutes, and his partner had started moaning loudly at 5 in order to fake a convincing orgasm, so he'd be done sooner, Minali thought cynically. Men who boasted about their sexual prowess were rarely any good in bed. Phil was the perfect example of that. Violet appeared in the doorway to the office Minali had commandeered to take the man's statement. You done with yours yet? She asked. Yeah, Minali sighed, thanking Theron before dismissing him back to the front end of the shop. What time is it? 12:45. The forensic boys have been and gone, the body's bagged and on its way to autopsy, and I have a statement from a mermaid that she never saw anything before she closed the shop last night. She just left to quarantine the crabs. We might have time to grab lunch before we head up to the morgue, where the body should be cleaned up and ready for autopsy, Violet said. Minali knew there had once been a time when the thought of eating lunch before viewing a body, or watching an autopsy, would have turned her stomach. That time was long past though. She'd seen a lot in this job, both on Elysium and on New Hope. Sure. Anything but fish, Minali replied. Half an hour and 2 curries later, they emerged from a restaurant, ready to get back to work. Violet pulled out her tablet to tap out a message. After a moment she said, Remind me again, what was the guy's name you questioned in the fish shop? Minali blinked, but her memory blanked on her. I don't remember. She reached into her bag for her tablet. Shit, I must have left my tablet in the shop. You go on ahead. I'll meet you at the morgue. Minali marched into the fish shop, deliberately avoiding meeting the gaze of the man standing at the counter. I'll only be a minute, she called softly over her shoulder. Her tablet was right there on the table. Minali snatched it up and turned to go. She had a body to view. Sven waited for the doors to hiss open before trudging into the shop. He wasn't looking forward to this conversation one bit. If he'd known being the leader of the colony mare community would involve so much relationship counseling, he never would have taken the job. He had no experience at this sort of thing. He'd only loved one woman in his life, and she. Sven shook his head, trying to drive out all thoughts of her. It was worse now she'd returned to the mare community with her husband to have her baby. Seeing her so happy with him. Sven, I need to talk to you, Theron began. Sven waved him into silence. Unless it's about Melpomene and Melusine, I don't want to hear it. Those 2 girls are destroying the peace of our community because of you. A man who deserts his child has no place in our community. Theron paled. I haven't deserted her. She's right next door. It's Melpomene who can't stand hearing the baby cry when she wants one of her own. We're trying and trying, but she just can't seem to conceive. The girls were inseparable until Melusine got pregnant. Sometimes they'd ignore me for days, but it all changed when she started to show. She's got me up most nights, all night. If I even suggest going next door to Melusine to help with the baby, she turns into a raging harpy. I don't know what to do. Sven comforted the man as best he could, noticing for the first time the dark circles around Theron's eyes. The limited gene pool and difficulty conceiving had hit them all hard. Theron excused himself to go to the bathroom, hurrying away, but not before Sven caught the younger man wiping away a tear. Sven wondered how many miscarriages and false alarms Theron had endured with the two women, before they'd managed to have a living child. Sven could scarcely imagine it. He'd expected a childless future for himself, for he knew Ali couldn't have children, or at least that's what he'd thought. Now he'd still never have offspring, because how could he, without a woman he loved and cherished enough to carry a single kid for him? As if on cue, a woman walked into the shop. Human, most likely, from the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. Titans would at least offer him a respectful nod, as was due the leader of the mare. Humans either didn't notice him, too focused on all the fish, or thought he was one of them. More fool them. This woman walked in as if she owned the place, striding around the counter and into the office before Sven could form a protest, let alone voice one. Only a mare woman would ignore him like that, and he knew every mare in the colony. Unless there was another woman like Ali hidden among the human population. Sven crossed to the office door, his heart rate rising eagerly at the hope flowering in his mind. She wore her hair like a dark cap, short and close to her head, though it curled slightly around her ears. Her figure was athletic, like a mare, but he was certain he'd never seen her before. "Miss, this office is for staff only," Sven said. "Detective," she responded, sounding lost in thought. "And I only came back to get my tablet, like I said." She peered down at the item in question and jabbed her finger at the screen. "Theron," she added as an afterthought. Sven's jaw dropped. Theron had 3 women, not 2, and he'd arranged his trysts with this one in the office of Sven's shop. "I'm not Theron," he said heavily, almost wishing he were. There was something about this woman's eyes as she brought them up to meet his that was extraordinary. They held deep sadness, but in those depths was something like determination. Still, Theron had a knack both for attracting women, and for making them anything but happy. Sven wouldn't be so careless if a woman loved him the way they all seemed to love Theron. Some men didn't know how lucky they were. "I can see that," she said. Her gaze hardened. "Who are you and where were you last night?" "Sven Grun, and right here," he replied promptly. What he would have given to spend last night with her in his private pool. "Theron didn't mention that there was anyone else here last night," she said. There was a question in both her tone and her eyes that Sven could only guess at. "Well, he wasn't here, was he?" "He was at home. Banging his other girlfriend while the mother of his child listened next door," Sven thought but didn't say. "What were you doing here?" she demanded. Sven couldn't suppress a grin. She was half his size but she radiated power. He could see why Theron liked her. "Honing my skills. You wouldn't believe how good I am with my hands." He winked. "I could show you if you like." Her lips pursed in what Sven imagined was disapproval, which only made him want to kiss them. She had quite a sexy pout. "Unbelievable," she said, half under her breath. Sven's grin widened. "Yes, I am." This only seemed to irritate her more. "I think you need to come with me." Sven just barely managed to stop himself from cheering. This woman was reading his mind. "I'm at your service, ma'am." "Detective," she snapped. "I'd rather interrogate the fish," she added softly. The merman heard every word with his acute hearing. "If the lady wants the fish, she gets the fish," he said triumphantly. "Tell me what else you desire and it's yours." He crossed to the door of the shop and set the sign to closed. Maybe things were looking up after all. After an hour stuck with Sven, Minali was ready to punch through the wall of the interrogation room. Between the man's beaming smile and transparent innuendos, she wasn't sure whether Sven was an idiot, or if he was full of so much sleaze there wasn't room for anything else in his head. "Tell me again what you were doing in the shop last night," Minali said through gritted teeth. "What I do best. I coax the fish out of the tank and break its neck before it knows what's happening. Then it's all about the strokes of the blade. You have to get it just right, on the right angle to hit the sweet spot. Then slow and steady. She knew he was talking about filleting fish, but that deep velvety voice, the cheeky look in his eyes and the stroking motions he made with his hands made her hot in all sorts of the wrong ways. No sane person would associate gutting fish with sex, but she was fast reaching the point where she'd never be able to look a fish in the eye again without blushing or thinking of Sven. If that was even his name. The door to the interview room squeaked open behind her, and Minali turned, grateful for the distraction. "Ah, what are you doing?" Violet asked, looking from Minali to Sven. "Taking a statement," Minali replied. "Mr. Grun here was in the shop last night at the time of the murder, alone, which makes him an important witness." She didn't need to add that it also made him the prime suspect. "Murder?" Sven blurted out. "What murder?" Minali had to give him credit. His surprise looked almost genuine. Violet paled, but she responded before Minali could. "There was a murder in Metropolis last night, and the body was found in seafood supply this morning by one of your staff. A man named Theron," Minali supplied. If anything, Sven only looked more shocked than before. "And he didn't tell me anything about it? Who was it? Where was it? If any blood got into the tanks, I'll have to quarantine all the fish. I can't sell stock that have eaten people." He appeared truly horrified at the idea, almost as though he'd never seen a dead body before, let alone last night, when he freely admitted he'd been hacking up fish corpses. Once again it was Violet who replied, "When Theron found the body in the crab tank, he called the watch. By the time I arrived on site this morning, a mare named Melpomene had started shifting the crabs out of the tank, so we could get a forensic team in there to remove the body. She died sometime last night. The body's in the morgue with our best autopsy guy on it, and we hope to get some answers soon." She placed her hands by her sides like she was standing to attention, military style, before nodding deeply in Sven's direction. "Thank you very much for your assistance. We'll be in touch if we have any further information." Before Minali could protest, Violet opened the door and ushered Sven out. Minali's anger had enough time to work up a full head of steam by the time Violet returned to the interview room and closed the door behind her. "What in stars did you just do with my suspect?" Minali demanded. "That man is the most likely person to be our murderer, and you let him go so he can go kill some other poor, unsuspecting woman?" Violet grimaced. "Please tell me you didn't arrest him." "You didn't give me the chance to." Minali exploded. Violet appeared relieved. "Thank the stars for that. You can't arrest that man unless you have ironclad evidence. Video footage. Witnesses. Possibly a confession from the man himself." Minali snorted. "The only thing that man will confess to is thinking he's the universe's gift to women. They all think that. Comes with being a good-looking guy. I take it he's the reason you never made it to the morgue?" Minali nodded. Violet took the seat Sven had vacated. "Let me fill you in on what we know so far then. No visible bruises on the body. Likely cause of death is drowning." "Do we have the victim's name yet?" Minali asked. Women who died at the hands of a violent man didn't deserve to be anonymous. Their names should be remembered, for they were casualties of the war Minali fought every day until she died. A war the Senate didn't admit existed, though she knew otherwise. There's the interesting part. We have a Jane Doe. No implants, no file on the database, nothing. According to colony records, she doesn't exist. Violet frowned. No one gets in or out of the colony without us knowing. No one. Minali had heard rumors that this wasn't true. For the right price, a person could bribe their way in or out, and maybe even off-planet too. She recalled a people smuggling case one of the others had been working on a while back, which was definitely shipping people out of New Hope for slave labor. But no one had been smuggled into the colony, as far as Minali knew. Every arrival was logged and scanned. In order to sneak in, they'd need to know someone inside the colony. Someone must know who she is. Do we know anything about her movements before she died? Minali asked. I have the data guys looking into surveillance footage outside the fish shop. No cameras inside, of course, but plenty out in the square. She can't have just appeared out of nowhere. And nor had her murderer, Minali added silently to herself. She'd be looking very closely at sleazy Sven, for most criminals rarely stopped at one. With his mind full of murder and that tempting detective, Sven wasn't sure how he managed to return home. He exchanged nods of greeting with the other mayor as he headed for his cubicle at the highest point of the underwater domicile. Normally, he'd have spent a few hours in his office in the air beside his private pool, dealing with the community's problems. Today, he needed a night off to process his thoughts. Firstly, the detective wasn't Theron's girlfriend. If anything, she was more sex-starved than Sven himself, and that was saying something. Even the slightest innuendo he made provoked a reaction in her, something that wouldn't happen if she was joining regularly with a merman. He was almost certain she was human, which surprised him. He'd never looked twice at one before Ali hooked up with that human man, and then he'd only done so to glare at the man. The detective was different. She drew his gaze the way a siren would with a song. Yet he recognized Mare's song a mile away, and she hadn't been singing in the slightest. Sven found it hard to believe a dead body had been found in the Mare fish shop, but Violet knew better than to lie to a mare, even a merman like him. She knew who he was, even if the detective didn't. But a body? He'd been at the shop for most of the night, venting his frustration on the fish for sale. If someone had come into the shop while he was there, he'd have seen them, or at least heard them. Unless they'd come in while the fish were fighting again. Then he wouldn't have heard anything over the splashing in the tanks. Sven, I need your help. Sven looked up, surprised to see Theron. What happened? They threw me out. I'm not allowed to sleep with them or even share a cubicle anymore, Theron said mournfully. Them. It seemed Melusine and Melpomene had made up, to the exclusion of Theron. That was an interesting development. There should be some bachelor bunks down on the bottom level, as well as a bunk room on the surface. There's always free hammocks there, Sven said. No mare wanted to sleep in the open air when they could drift in a hammock below the surface, lulled to sleep by the gentle underwater currents. Thanks, I think I'll go below, Theron said, turning to swim away. Wait. Sven had to know, even if he didn't want to ask. What did the shop look like this morning? With the dead body and all. Was there a lot of blood? Theron shook his head. No, just the girl floating face down in the tank. I didn't see her at first, but then I turned the water pumps on and her hair started to move in the current. I thought it was one of the girls, come in before me to check the tanks, but she didn't have a tail or gills and she wasn't moving. He swallowed. She wasn't one of ours, so I called the watch. I didn't know what to do. It was on the tip of Sven's tongue to say that Theron should have called him, as the leader of their community and the manager of the shop, but that wasn't true. If the girl wasn't Mare, then she wasn't his problem. There were plenty of other races out there, both human and Titan, and none of them were his responsibility. Leading their little community was hard enough to manage. He wasn't going to go peacekeeping for the whole colony. Leave that to people like Ali and the Watch. You did the right thing, Sven said instead. Let the Watch and the hot little detective find the killer. He'd help her in any way he could, but as a favor. Because he wanted to see her again. He wanted to see the sadness in her eyes disappear. Catching a killer would help do that, surely. And maybe she'd be so grateful for his help that she'd consider spending an evening with him. Grinning at the thought, he dismissed Theron and lay back in his hammock, dreaming of what the detective might look like naked. Minali peered at the fuzzy surveillance footage again, but she still couldn't work out what she was supposed to see. "Explain it to me," she said finally. "Can't you see it?" the tech guy, Minali couldn't remember his name, Doug or Dig or Dog or something, demanded. "It's the same in all of them." "All I see is blurry footage that should be clear," Minali snapped. "Exactly. Someone's messed with all the cameras along this road and then across the square to your shop. It's like interference, but nothing like I've ever seen before." Minali turned to Violet. "Is there a Titan who can mess with video cameras?" Violet shrugged. "Even I don't know half the abilities some Titans have. We've spent centuries fighting each other. We're not about to buddy up and share all our strengths and weaknesses, in case we're the next targets. Sure, there's probably a few Titans who can manipulate light or electricity or the data signals those things send. I mean, I feed off freaking orgasms, and even I don't know how that works. Fuzzying up a few cameras is normal in comparison." Doug the dog, or whoever he was, looked really interested. "If you're hungry, I'll take you out anytime," he said eagerly. Violet grimaced. "Sorry dude, I like tits and you don't have them." She stared pointedly at the screen. "But if you help me find my murderer, I might just forget you said that, and not report you for sexual harassment." A flustered dog turned back to the surveillance footage. Yeah. Your guy. Well, here's the thing. The footage goes fuzzy at about the same speed as someone walking, so if it's a device or some weird ability, it's on your victim or the killer. The footage outside the shop blurs just before 2 a.m. Autopsy puts the time of death between 2 and 3, Violet said, nodding. So definitely your guy. I checked all the cameras around the square, then traced it back to a bar. This place. Doug tapped and a clear picture came up, showing the front of the bar in question. The Moon and Sixpence. The pub where we all go for Friday night drinks, Minali said slowly. Phil's favorite pub, where he'd picked up his orgy a few nights ago. The dog's face fell. No one ever invited me along. Me neither, Violet chimed in. Maybe it's just the detectives, Minali said. Violet nodded. Guess I'd better try it this weekend then, if we haven't solved the case by then. Minali silently prayed they'd have their suspect well and truly arrested before the weekend. Not even for work would she be willing to venture into a pub again. Especially not one where she might encounter Phil looking for his next one-night stand. Do we have any footage of the inside of the bar? Violet asked. Sure, but it's blurry from just after 8. The only clear camera angle at all for the whole 6 hours is one down the road, that just happens to catch the front door of the bar. I checked the footage from 8 to 2 and I can't find when your victim entered the place, but I did spot her leaving. Right here at 1:45. For a moment Minali glimpsed the girl before she moved out of sight. It didn't matter how many times she saw such things. It was still surreal to see someone's last moments, knowing they'd be dead in a very short time, while they themselves were blissfully unaware of their fate. This girl seemed to have an inkling, Minali thought, from the way her worried gaze darted around before she hurried off. Almost as if she was running from someone or something. Who came out after she did? Minali asked, leaning in for a closer look. Dunno. Doug tapped at the screen again, and the video resumed playing. A hulking figure stepped out of the bar, his broad shoulders barely clearing the doorframe. His fair hair looked almost white in the nighttime lighting, and Minali found herself willing the man to turn around. Not that she really needed him to. There couldn't be that many men in the colony who were built like Norse gods, and were suspects in this investigation. She could only think of one. Sven, Minali said under her breath. Violet had come to a similar conclusion. It had better not be, she said. Find out where he went, whether he disappeared into the path of blurry footage, or whether he went somewhere else entirely. If it's him, we need to be certain. An hour later, while Doug the dog painstakingly hopped from one camera feed to another, Violet's frown refused to budge. I'll bring him in for questioning, Minali promised, rising to her feet. Just as long as that's all it is for the moment, Violet said. She pulled out her tablet. I need to make some calls, and then we both need to pay a visit before this investigation goes any further. I don't like this case one bit. A clear-cut killer, who had all the evidence pointed towards him, made this case one of the easiest Minali had ever worked on. What wasn't there to like about that? Sven decided he didn't like this situation one bit, as he watched the surveillance footage in disbelief. From the set lines of the detective's lips, there was no doubt in her mind that the man in the video was him, and no matter how many times he denied ever entering the bar on that night or any other, she didn't believe him. When he admitted he'd never drunk so much as a mouthful of alcohol, let alone stepped into an establishment that sold the stuff, she'd looked absolutely incredulous. He slumped in his seat. With the notable exception of the week Ali had brought her human partner to live in their community, this was the worst week of his life. First the situation with Theron, and the dead body turning up in his shop, and now the watch believing he was the killer. But Sven was the leader of the mayor in the colony, not some fingerling who hadn't turned his tail for the first time. His people wouldn't have put him in charge if they didn't think he could handle the responsibility. He banished the sneaking thought that the only reason he'd gotten the job had been because no one else wanted it. The cohabitation experiment with humans was hardly a desirable assignment. He'd always known it would be difficult. The risk that the mayor would have to step up and assume peacekeeping duties within the colony had always been high. Was this an attempt to discredit the mayor in the lead-up to insurrection? For the first time in his life, Sven wished he'd paid more attention to politics. If it weren't for Ali, he wouldn't have wasted a moment of his time in learning about it, but she'd been there in the peace talks between Titans and humans at the end of the war, broadcast across the Auton system. How could he not watch? The war had changed her, while the rest of the mayor stayed the same. He'd expected her to be as bitter about the end of the war as she was about her husband's death, but all he'd seen in her eyes was steely resolve. The kind of resolve that had killed thousands or would see the end of a war. Up close in the colony, he'd expected to see something different again, but she'd still surprised him. From the first, she was the only person who seemed to be happy she'd moved to the colony. If he'd been framed for a murder that could destabilize she wouldn't be happy. The watch arresting him would be the least of his worries. He had to deal with this, whatever it took. Silence had fallen over the interview room, as though the watch expected him to fill it. Sven drew himself up, more than equal to the task. I take responsibility for all of this, he said steadily. A human turning up dead in my shop is a tragedy that should never have happened. The detective stared at him. Wait, is that a confession? You're admitting responsibility for the murder? Someone who understood politics less than he did. Oh, he liked this detective more than ever. Sven flashed her his most charming smile. Of course I take responsibility. As a leader should. The shop was part of the mayor community, even if it was located in Metropolis and not the aquatic dome. If he didn't, he may as well step down and let the others choose a replacement for him. Sven wasn't going to give up that easily. The detective's eyes gleamed with triumph. Then I will place you on our list of contacts willing to help the watch in our investigation into this matter, Violet finished smoothly. Thank you again, Mr. Grun. We will be in touch. This didn't please the detective at all. Her eyes blazed as she opened her mouth to protest, but Violet kicked her under the table. "Can I talk to you in my office, please?" the detective said instead, looking daggers at Violet. Sven bade the women goodbye and beat a retreat back to the shop. He wasn't sure whether to feel sorry for the succubus or the detective. What he would have given to be a fly on the wall during their discussion. Instead of her desk in their open-plan office, Minali led Violet to the lunchroom, which was mercifully empty at this time of day. The moment the door closed behind Violet, Minali snapped, "What do you think you're doing? We have a responsibility to arrest him. He confessed his guilt right there on record. What more do you need? Letting him go like that is a criminal offense all on its own." Violet didn't look the slightest bit ruffled. He didn't confess to anything. He claimed responsibility, which is tantamount to warning us off his case. "Since when do the watch take orders from criminals?" Minali demanded. Realizing her mistake, she amended, "At least the ones who aren't crooked, I mean. Some people are not subject to the same justice as the rest of us," Violet said. "No one's above the law," Minali insisted. Violet laughed. "Oh, I never said he was above the law. Just that he's subject to different justice to the rest of us. And he called us on it. His people take a different view on violence to humans or even other titans. And the Senate know this, they built it into the peace treaties. I'm sure it's in the laws for the colony too, though well hidden in lawyer speak and all. Why do you think I'm on this case? I sure didn't do anything to deserve the promotion. I liked where I was." She sniffed. "Beat cop is much more fun. I had my hand right on the pulse of this place. But the powers that be insisted they needed my special knowledge on this case. Now I see why." Violet's gaze turned calculating. "How much do you know about Mare?" Minali laughed shakily. "Until this case, I didn't know they existed. Even now I've seen one, it's still hard to believe." "Ah." The single syllable seemed to hold a world of knowledge and superiority that Violet doubted Minali would ever understand. Violet glanced at her wrist. "Good thing we have a few hours before we're expected at the Mare community. We're going to need every second to bring you up to speed." Minali's head spun. First merpeople existed, and now she was going to see a whole bunch of them. The universe was a stranger place than she'd thought. If Minali had thought her head was spinning before Violet launched into her anthropology lecture, she was mistaken. Her head hurt at everything Violet had told her. Minali held her hands up for silence. "Okay, let me get things straight. Mermaids are one of the most dangerous titans, if not the most deadly, because they could wipe everyone else out if they wanted to. The only reason they haven't is because they don't feel like it, but they could change their minds tomorrow and we'd all be dead. They brokered the peace treaty between titans and humans, and they get special privileges as a result. One of them is an isolated community right here in the colony, which doesn't mix with the rest of the population except at seafood supply, where they provide fish to sell to the other residents." Violet nodded. Minali continued, "Okay, so that explains a few things. One, I've never seen them before because they keep to themselves. Their part in the peace process was not publicized because that's the way they wanted it. They're here in the colony to maintain the peace and make sure we don't kill each other. So a body found on their premises has the potential to be a diplomatic incident, if it shows they're the ones who broke the peace. But I still don't understand why we couldn't arrest their employee and charge him for the murder. It's not like Sven's a mermaid." Minali couldn't help laughing at the thought of the big man sitting on a rock, singing and flapping his sparkling tail while he combed his hair. Violet looked like she wanted to explain some more, but she contented herself with, "You'll see when we get there." She brought the speeder to a halt in a nondescript stretch of corridor in the aquatic dome. The only door in view had no number on it, like the numerous utility doors in the maintenance corridors, but Violet approached it hesitantly. Look, Mare can be easily offended, and that's the last thing we want. Given your inexperience with them, let me take the lead on this. Try to say as little as possible. If you have any questions, write them down. I'll answer them later, or if I can't, we can make another time to ask the Mare. Politics had never been Minali's strong point, as her supervisors had loved to remind her. It had cost her more than one promotion. Though it rankled to play second fiddle to someone who had only been a constable last week, Violet acted like she knew what she was doing. If she didn't, and she blew the whole investigation because of it, Minali would simply say so in her report. After all, Sven was still here in the colony. All Minali would have to do was swing by his place and pick him up. Arresting him would be easy. It wasn't like he could flee the planet. Minali nodded curtly. She would let Violet lead just this once. Violet palmed open the door and ushered Minali inside. Minali walked down a short, curving corridor before stopping in wonder. The corridor opened up into a private parkland, not unlike the public ones throughout the other domes. Given this was the aquatic dome, she shouldn't have been surprised at the number of pools, set on various different levels so that water cascaded from one to the other in an ornamental display like some of the ancient gardens she'd heard about on old Earth. Fish splashed and played in the pools. Occasionally, the jeweled colors of a mermaid's tail broke the surface, only to vanish into the depths again. It's beautiful, she breathed. Violet managed a rueful smile. They think they're slumming it, to hear them tell it. They've claimed an island archipelago in the tropics of one of the Titan planets. Delta, I think. The rest of their people are involved in terraforming the place, and establishing the island ecosystems above and below the surface. They have a couple of coral species that make our 3D printers look primitive. Most of them can't wait to go back. The credits they earn here will go toward the island infrastructure they can't bioengineer, I'm told. Even the income from the fish shop is held in the communal accounts. It's a strange system, but it works for them. Minali had heard of communism in her history lessons at school, but all she could recall was that it was a corrupt system that hadn't worked well on Earth. And the police of that regime had relied on a network of paid informers that spanned more than a third of the population. A climate of fear Minali wouldn't have wanted to live in. Do they have a spy network too? Minali asked. That would explain their different justice system. People who committed crimes just disappearing. Violet laughed so hard she almost doubled over. Mere spies? Among their own? What a waste of time. Mere are so open with each other, in the time it took a spy to make a report, the whole community would already know. They don't keep secrets here. But they did keep secrets from the outside world and the rest of the colony, Minali added silently. Or she would have heard of mermaids before now. Everyone in the community would know about Sven and the murder, but they might not breathe a word of it to her. Closed communities like this didn't warm easily to outsiders. Was Violet an outsider to them, or had she earned their trust? Minali's instincts told her the latter. Is Ali here? Violet asked a woman who surfaced in the nearest pool. No idea. Try up at her house. The woman lifted a dripping arm from the water to point at a cluster of low buildings halfway up the hill. She ducked under the water again, her silvery tail blending with the fish until she disappeared altogether. Violet shrugged and led the way up the hill. The sounds of a small child screaming grew steadily louder as they approached. Ali! Violet called as she reached a doorway. The door flew open and a harried-looking man wearing shorts and nothing else peered out. He held a struggling baby in his arms, whose lusty screaming drowned out all other sound. She's not here and she should be home by now. Cece was due a feed an hour ago and she won't stop screaming. Violet held her arms out for the bawling infant, apparently immune to the noise the child made. Didn't one of the other mare have a baby recently? You could ask her to feed her. If not, I'm sure you can buy baby formula from one of the stores in town. You can buy breast milk? The man asked, incredulous. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of many sleepless nights. A substitute for it, yes. Humans do it all the time, Violet said. I'm sure it won't do her any harm. Human. The word made Minali look at the man. 2 legs just like her. You're human, she blurted out. What are you doing living with mermaids if you're human? Violet held up the squirming baby. Out of the blankets peeped the flukes of a pink tail. He married one, she said shortly, a warning note in her tone. Quiet, with no questions, Minali remembered. Right. Not that it helped. Now she couldn't help but think about how a Titan-human pairing had produced a child. A Titan child. Did that mean all the Titans could have children with humans? If they could, then in the future, both races could become so mixed no one would be able to tell Titan from human. No one wanted to go to war against their parents or their children or their siblings. You couldn't have war unless there was a difference between us and them. If there was just us. Are you entertaining without me? A female voice called. Into the room stepped Ali, Minali said in surprise, recognizing the cheerful plumber who'd fixed her toilet when Phil shoved so many condoms down it that it got blocked. Only now did it dawn on her that he'd probably been having orgies for longer than she'd realized. Is there a plumbing problem here in the mare habitat? I sure hope not, Ali replied, scooping up the squirming baby with one hand and planting a kiss on her head. I have a milk emergency to see to first, right Cece? She settled into a chair to feed the baby, gesturing for the others to find a seat too. Galen, could you sort out some refreshments please? I think we'll need them. Ali's husband disappeared through a door Minali hadn't seen before. When she peeped through it, she found Galen stood in a kitchen larger than her lunchroom, with a bigger table too. For a plumber, Ali sure had a lot of space. Minali's tiny apartment could have fitted inside this place twice over, and there'd still be room to spare. Not to mention the windows that looked out over the ponds. Minali definitely couldn't afford an apartment with a window on her salary. Yet Ali. Violet held out a box of what Minali recognized as the most expensive chocolates in the colony. I brought you a little gift, she said. Ali thanked her and set the box on the table beside her. Didn't she know her gift had cost more than a week's salary? Minali couldn't believe Ali would leave such a precious item out where anyone could see it, instead of locked away where no one could steal it. Violet accepted a cup of coffee from Galen. A few days ago, the watch received a report that there was more than just fish floating in the tanks of your shop. So I got called in to investigate. She proceeded to tell Ali everything Minali herself knew about the murder case. Details no member of the public should be privy to, in Minali's opinion. More often than not, some of those lesser-known details were how they identified the killer, because only he knew all of them as well as the watch themselves. None of this seemed to surprise Ali, who simply nodded as Violet told her tale. Finally, Violet reached the part about Sven. She described all of the evidence against him and finished with, "So what do you think?" Ali paused to hand her now sleeping baby to her husband before she said gravely, "I think if he's the one who killed this woman, then he has no place here with us." "And if he didn't?" Violet asked. Ali smiled bleakly. "Then someone is playing with fire and they will be burned." Sven swam the length of the fish ponds, from top to bottom and back again. Then he did it again. He was stalling and he knew it. He didn't know enough about human Titan politics to solve this mess on his own. He needed the help of an expert, and no one knew diplomacy like Ali. If he wanted to keep his position and solve this murder, he needed to cast his pride aside and beg for her help. So it was with a heavy heart that he headed up the hill to the house she shared with her husband. Ali's voice floated out of the open window. "I think if he's the one who killed this woman, then he has no place here with us." Sven froze. It was one thing for the detective to believe him guilty of murder, but Ali, who'd known him since he was a boy? It took him a moment to realize she was speaking again, talking about how he'd always been eager to join the war effort and fight against humans, but that she never thought he'd actually do it. It was one thing to kill people on the opposing side of a war where your own survival was at stake, and another to kill a defenseless girl in cold blood in peacetime. Not that Sven had ever killed anyone. No, what he'd meant was that he supported Ali in her quest for vengeance during the war. Nothing more. He wasn't sure he could lift a hand against anyone, human or Titan, if it came down to it. But Ali believed he could. Sven didn't want to listen any more to her misguided ideas about him. No wonder she'd turned him down, she'd never really known him at all. Well, he'd show her, he'd solve this mystery without her and prove he was every bit the leader he deserved to be. A splash drew his eye to the ponds. Melusine and Melpomene had patched things up. Melusine's baby was nowhere to be seen, probably in the newly created creche Sven had arranged only this week, he thought smugly, as the two women twined around one another, demonstrating how deeply they cared for the other's pleasure. Sven sighed, feeling a stirring of envy as he watched them. He'd give anything to have a partner who cared so deeply for his body and his needs. Someone who knew him better than he knew himself. Of course, he'd happily reciprocate. Twice over if need be. Such an incredible woman deserved an attentive man. Sven slid into the water, shifting to his tail to hide his desire. Not soon enough, however. "I know. I'm going crazy here," mourned a male voice beside Sven. Theron couldn't take his eyes off the two women. "They don't need me at all." Melpomene glanced in their direction and gave Melusine a particularly passionate kiss, as she tweaked the other woman's nipples. "I showed her how to do that," Theron complained. Sven watched for a long moment, making sure his hypothesis was correct, before he said, "You know they're teasing you, don't you? I bet if you asked to join them right now, you'd have both hands full before you can blink." "Really?" Theron's voice glowed with hope. Sven felt unbearably hot. The girls were really putting on a show. If he were Theron, he'd be in the thick of things 5 minutes ago. Definitely. Theron swam so fast, he skimmed across the surface to the women he loved. Sven would have given anything to be in Theron's position right now. Violet rose, thanking Ali profusely for her time. Minali wasn't sure why. The plumber had hardly offered any new information for their investigation. "I'll have a talk to Cole and see what he can come up with. Perhaps he'll have an answer to your surveillance issue," Ali offered. This meant nothing to Minali, but Violet nodded. Evidently she knew this Cole person and respected his advice. Minali said nothing. Any further information on this case would be welcome, however biased it might be. Violet lingered to say her farewells to Galen and Cece, while Minali headed down the hill. She stared across the pools as she waited, wondering what exactly she was seeing. It looked like around a dozen mere clustered in the one pool. Minali moved closer for a better look. Some of them were swimming so closely together their tails bumped on every stroke, while some looked as human as she was except for the gills striping their sides. Two women kissed passionately, waist-deep in the water, and Minali cast her eyes down to give the women some privacy. Only to discover that both women were sitting on a third person submerged half a meter below the surface. One woman straddled the thrusting hips, while the other seemed to hold the person in a headlock between her thighs. The headlock woman threw her head back and let out a loud moan, urged on by her friend. Stars. Another bloody orgy, Minali realized. A dozen naked mermaids, no, merpeople, she realized, seeing a rippled six-pack for a moment before it was obscured by a pair of ample breasts. There were mermen too. The more she looked, the more she saw. Tails and legs, arms and heads, all tangled together above and below the surface, without a scrap of clothing in sight. This place made Phil's orgy look tame. But from the bliss on these women's faces, their orgasms weren't faked. Why didn't the merpeople go out and conquer the Alton system? Because they enjoyed screwing each other too much to be bothered with anyone else. Maybe there was something to this hippie nudist community after all, Minali mused. If the guys gave orgasms that good, maybe she should try nudity for a few days when she got leave. Want to join in? A male voice asked. Minali glared at the speaker. How dare he read her thoughts like that? But her thoughts hadn't been read by just anyone. In the pool before her sat a grinning Sven, fanning his emerald green tail out before him as he gestured along the length of his perfectly muscled torso. Man or fish, take your pick, lovely lady, he purred. Though her head screamed at her to run from the murder suspect, her loins felt an unfamiliar burn that she thought she'd extinguished years ago. The man was sex incarnate, she had to admit. Not now, not ever, fishtail, she retorted in a tone so frosty it could have chilled deep space. If only it could cool the fires of her roaring ardor. Actually, my full name is Poseidon, if you don't like screaming, oh my god, Sven. He winked at her, then leaped into the air, like a dolphin. He turned a lazy somersault, then flipped over to execute a perfect dive. Maybe another time, lovely lady, he called over his shoulder. He undulated away, giving her a good view of his perfectly formed, bright green ass. Why didn't you take him up on his offer? Violet asked. Because he's a murder suspect and I don't fancy being his next victim, Minali snapped. Scaly-skinned creep. Violet laughed softly. They don't have scales, you know. That skin's soft as a dolphin's. If I liked men, I'd let him glide between my thighs any day. Not that he's ever offered. He must really like you. I make it a rule not to have sex with suspects, Minali said stiffly. Violet didn't stop laughing until they stood outside the door that hid the mare nudist colony. Sven didn't do it, you know, she said as the door hissed shut behind them. Ali's certain of it. Ali the plumber? Minali scoffed. What would a plumber know about catching a killer? Violet's hand landed heavily on Minali's shoulder. You remember what I said about how dangerous mare are? Sure, but you didn't mean Ali. She's... Minali meant to say human, but she stopped. Ali had picked up the baby mermaid and breastfed her. Her husband was human, which meant... Ali's a mare? That she is. Minali choked down her surprise. But that doesn't make her omniscient. It just means she has a tail. She thought about it for a moment. Huh. A mermaid plumber. I bet that tail comes in real useful at times. Maybe the gills too. Violet lowered her voice so Minali could barely hear it. Look, you said you never heard of mare before now. Did you ever hear of any mare who fought in the war? Minali racked her brains but had to admit defeat. No. I never heard of one before this week. What about Halcyon? That rang a faint bell. Minali had heard that name before. It was only a rumor, but even the human police heard about Halcyon. A guerrilla unit that hit civilian targets, racking up quite a body count. Even after the war was over, we still had procedures in place to keep watch for them. Guerrilla fighters rarely stop fighting even when the surrender's signed, and they're hard to catch, so you can never be sure if you have all of them. At least, that's what Earth's history tells us. Violet shook her head. Halcyon targeted secret military facilities, where prisoners were kept and tortured. Halcyon was mare. Minali's jaw dropped. I thought you said they didn't believe in violence, that mer people never fought? Violet's eyes darkened. They didn't. Until a human took a mer prisoner. They tortured him before they killed him. Only then did the mer join the war. Not for any of the reasons the rest of us fought, but for justice. Mer justice. For the first time in centuries, the Mer Council appointed a Mer enforcer, Halcyon. It took Minali a moment to process this, and when she did, she could scarcely believe it. One Mer killed all those people. Violet nodded, looking expectant. Minali had worked as a detective too long for the pieces to refuse to click together. No. You expect me to believe Ali killed thousands of people? Thousands of my people, and she's roaming around the colony now, free as a bird? Even as the words left her lips, more pieces fitted together. Ali's spacious house. Violet's reverence for the woman as she shared all she knew. The gift of chocolate. Stars, Minali breathed. Why didn't I know earlier? All the watch should know about her. Violet shook her head. The higher-ups know, and those of us who need to know. Me for instance, and now you. Ali likes things the way they are, and we tend to respect her wishes. And not blow her cover, Minali added silently. The Mer woman had one hell of a cover. Even Minali had allowed the woman into her home without a qualm. But she wasn't paid to speculate about a woman who wasn't involved in her case. She had a murder to solve. Ali didn't say anything about Sven not being guilty. Instead, she talked about how he hated humans and she condemned the crime. Violet smiled. Oh, Ali's a politician to the core. She was laying the boundaries, that's all. When she said if he'd done it, he didn't belong in their community. That meant she would leave him to Senate justice. A justice system that says a man's innocent until proven guilty. A Mer enforcer would never allow Senate justice to take precedence over Mer justice, except if he's innocent. If a Mer commits a crime or a crime is committed against a Mer, Mer justice applies. Always. So Sven can't possibly have committed the murder. If he had, he'd be dead already. So who did? Minali asked. Violet shrugged. If I knew, I'd whip out my handcuffs faster than I can take off a bra. Tomorrow, we'll have to turn our collective gaze away from sexy Sven. I hope you got a good look today. Minali's cheeks grew hot. She'd gotten an absolute eyeful today, which she doubted she'd ever forget. Want me to drop you home? She asked, stepping onto the speeder. Violet nodded and stepped up behind her. As long as you're not going to change your mind and go join Sven. Minali snorted. In his dreams. The speeder buzzed off. Later that night, Minali discovered that Sven had claimed her dreams too. When the hot naked merman came to her in her sleep, she succumbed so quickly to his charms that she startled herself awake, horrified at what her dream self had nearly done. Sex with a suspect? She'd rather suck Phil's lollipop, Minali groused to herself as she attempted in vain to get some Sven-free sleep that night. Minali was at lunch when she got the call about the autopsy results. She had to ask the mortuary technician to repeat himself twice before she understood. What do you mean the girl's not human? She asked. Humans got a digestive system. Your girl doesn't, came the reply. So she's a Titan? Maybe. Maybe not. Never seen anything like this. Isn't in my book of Titan biology neither. All the beings who have a body have to eat. This girl never ate a thing in her life. Minali didn't know what to make of this. But you said the cause of death was drowning. The girl had a mouth. I saw it. How can she not have a digestive system? No idea. She had lungs, heart, muscles, all the things needed for circulation. Just not eating and drinking and what comes after. The technician coughed. She ain't never had anal sex either, if you get my drift. Minali dismissed the bite of annoyance at the technician's unprofessional comment. It was normal to check a murder victim for signs of rape. Of course he checked her nether regions. Pretty sure she was a virgin, the technician added helpfully. No signs of rape, just like she hadn't had any bruises. Or a stomach. Do you even have a name for her? Minali ventured, not feeling much hope. You mean like something that isn't Jane Doe, or her race or whatever? Nope. Minali's heart didn't have far to sink. This case was getting more hopeless by the minute. So when will I have your report? Already emailed it to Ya. Minali thanked him and ended the call. She waited a moment, then called Violet. Tell me you have something, Violet said. Minali shook her head. Only more mysteries to add to the mix. You ever heard of a Titan who doesn't have a digestive system? She described the autopsy findings. No. Even those of us who have unusual food sources still have guts. This is something else. Violet paused, looking thoughtful. I wonder if there's a cloning facility here. Someone making human-like constructs for illegal brothels or something. Except, I haven't heard anything like that. And why kill her and leave her somewhere that's so easy to find? Unless that's what they wanted. Violet shook her head. Still doesn't explain the fuzzy surveillance footage though. It just doesn't make sense. I could ask my contacts in the sex industry, Minali began doubtfully. The prostitutes who'd testified against their employer in her last case might help her, especially if these clones were taking their jobs. Maybe as a last resort, Violet replied. Better to talk to Ali first. Can you call her? I'm trying to narrow down a list of suspects from the people who were in the bar that night. Do you know how many doppelgangers Sven has in the colony? It's like the recruiters headhunted men who looked like Nordic gods to tempt more women here. Minali ended the call and attempted to get in touch with Ali, but the guerrilla fighter turned plumber didn't answer her phone. Minali tried again several times over the afternoon and evening, with the same result. Before Minali went to bed, she considered calling again, but she shied away from the idea at the last minute. If Ali had been too busy dealing with a plumbing problem to answer the comm, she wouldn't appreciate an interruption now she was home with her family. Especially not from a stranger asking for a favor. It would take a much bigger box of chocolates than Minali could afford to smooth something like that over. So Minali rolled into bed, resolving to try again in the morning. It might be her day off, but a detective never really stopped working, not as long as she had an unsolved case turning over in her mind. Minali did her best to focus on the naked mermaid's face, and not the rest of her body. Was she supposed to ask for Ali or Halcyon? Violet had said the woman's history wasn't widely publicized, but she'd also said that the mayor didn't keep secrets from each other. Plus, she was here on official business. It didn't seem right to call a woman she barely knew by her nickname. Not now. Minali knew the cheerful plumber could kill her just as happily as she replaced a pipe. I'm here to see whoever's in charge here, Minali said finally. That would do. I called earlier and I'm expected. She'd been expected an hour ago, but the traffic jam caused by the aircar crash at peak hour in the morning, just as everyone was trying to get to work, had slowed her down more than she thought. She prayed Ali was still here, and that she wouldn't have to search the whole colony for the woman. The mayor woman pointed. Up by the top pool. Minali raised her eyes to the top of the housing complex, and caught a glimpse of light reflecting off something up there. It could be a pool she hadn't seen before, she reasoned. She sincerely hoped it wasn't full of cavorting naked people like the ones down here. Didn't these people work at all? She trudged up the slope to what turned out to be a round shallow pool with a waterfall at one end, that cascaded down to the fish ponds below. This one appeared to be empty though. "Hello," she called. "Hello." The voice that responded was deep and syrupy, doing things to her insides no sound should be able to, as none other than Sven surfaced from the seemingly empty pool. He stepped out of the water, shaking droplets off what Minali could only call his naked glory. The man was sex on a stick. And now he was out of the water, she could see exactly what he hid under his tail, jutting from his groin like. "I was just thinking about you," Sven continued. "Wondering how your investigation is going. Whether you have caught the culprit yet." Minali forced herself to meet the merman's eyes, hoping she wasn't blushing. "How did you do that?" she demanded. "Appear out of thin air like that?" "Ah, you mean you didn't see me in the pool? I wanted to be alone, but your company has changed my mind, so I show myself." Sven held up his hand, which faded from light brown to white, before taking on a greenish hue that matched the water behind him. If Minali wasn't watching closely, she'd think his hand had disappeared altogether. As she watched, his hand returned to the same color as the rest of him. "You're a chameleon," she breathed, naming an earth lizard that she'd heard stories of but never seen, one which could change color to mimic its surroundings. "No, I'm a merman." "A green one," he corrected. "A man who would very much like to share a pool with you." His tone made swimming sound like the dirtiest thing imaginable. Minali's eyes darted downward in time to see him harden further, as if his innuendo was intentional. She shoved away the mental picture of what it might feel like to allow something that long and hard slide inside her. "Where's Allie?" she said finally, when she could tear her eyes away. "One of the mermaids told me she was up here." Sven shrugged. "At work, fixing pipes and singing, I imagine. She never comes up here. This is my place." "You're the leader of this hippie nudist colony?" Minali asked in disbelief. It wasn't so hard to believe once she thought about it. This exhibitionist fit right in with the rest of them. He probably led the orgies. A slow smile lit Sven's face. "Which earns me this private pool higher than the others, which I will probably lose to someone else once you arrest me for the murder in my shop." Murder. Right. That's what she was here for. Minali pulled her tablet from her pocket, and flicked her fingers across the screen until the first photo appeared. "Well, maybe you can answer a question for me. Do you know what this is?" She thrust the tablet at him, desperately trying not to think of other kinds of thrusting. His hand closed around hers, surprisingly cool. "That's a naiad. How did you take this picture? Naiads don't often show themselves." "A what?" "A naiad, a water spirit who purifies lakes, streams, and other water bodies. She gets her energy from the flow of clean water. It's a lonely life though." Sven sighed. "Especially if she's dead," Minali blurted out. Sven snorted. "Naiads can't die. They're spirits. Immortal spirits made of energy. Energy that could interfere with the surveillance cameras, perhaps. But this girl was flesh and blood, the same as you and me." Minali remembered the girl's unusual biology. "Well, mostly like you and me. She drowned in your fish tank." Sven's eyes widened. "This is the murdered body you found in my shop?" "Oh no. That's not possible. A naiad hasn't taken corporeal form for centuries. And the amount of power it takes to do that? Belina wasn't anywhere near powerful enough to make a body for herself." Just when she'd thought he might not have anything to do with the murder, Sven went and incriminated himself all over again. Minali pounced. "You know her?" Sven's brow creased. "Her name was Belina, and she liked to spend time here. She liked the easy flow here," she said. "She envied us, I think. In her spirit form, she can't touch anyone, even her own kind. Sometimes she liked to watch my people at play, but other times it made her too sad. Sven managed a smile. I know how she felt. Minali could almost feel the sadness flowing from him. Like he hadn't known she was dead. Like he hadn't been her killer. Then why did you kill her? Minali asked, the words feeling wrong even as they left her lips. I didn't. Minali gazed into his eyes, looking for a lie she knew she wouldn't find. She believed him. Do you know who did? She asked. Sven shook his head. But I would do everything in my power to find out, and I will offer you everything you want if you will help me. Everything I want? How can you even begin to imagine you know what I want? Minali snapped. Sven smiled that slow, lazy smile as he spread his arms wide. I can offer you undreamed of pleasures that will make you scorn our orgies instead of staring avidly at them. Men are the best lovers the universe will ever know. Let me show you, detective. A taste of what I can offer you in thanks for your help. Minali looked him up and down. Stars help her, but she wanted him. How long had it been since she'd had passable sex, let alone something good? Screw that, he was a murder suspect. He hadn't done the deed. And he wanted to do a very different deed with her. What if I discover you're the culprit? She asked him. Then you will arrest me and send me off-world, and I will lose everything I have worked so hard for, Sven said softly. But you will still have the pleasure I give you, and I will have the memory of how beautiful you look at the pinnacle of joy. Minali's breath caught in her throat. Who talked like that? If he was half as good in bed as he was with his tongue, she'd be crazy to turn him down. And it wasn't like she was letting him drag her into some dark dungeon where no one could find her. Violet and Ali knew she'd be here. But she had the whole day ahead of her with nothing to do. I'm not joining in one of your orgies, she said firmly, allowing herself to stare at his body fully for the first time. A perfect specimen of a man. Better than anyone she'd ever touched before, let alone slept with. Sven chuckled, a delicious sound. No, I wouldn't share you with the others. We'll have the privacy of my pool for as long as you like me. Minali was lost. She'd never done something like this sober before, with her judgment unclouded by alcohol or some emotion she imagined was love. How do you want to do this? He stepped forward, so close she could feel the heat of him through her clothes before he kissed her neck. I would like to discover how I can give you the greatest pleasure, detective, he breathed against her throat as his hands touched her bare skin beneath her shirt. Minali wasn't sure what happened to her clothes, because Sven's deft hands were everywhere and the fabric was gone. Then he slid 2 questing fingers between her thighs and she could think of nothing else. Stars, but the man was good. He kissed her breasts as he carried her to the pool, and his fingers never stopped moving. Inside her, pressing at each sensitive spot until she thought she'd explode, before expertly moving away to find another to tease her with. Soon, she heard her own voice breathlessly begging for release with a desperation she could scarcely believe came from her. Sven hesitated for barely a moment before granting her wish with a few more deft strokes of his fingers. She cried out, truly seeing stars for a few moments before she managed to blink away her blindness. More? Sven asked blithely as he set her down in the pool. The water reached her breasts, buoying them up and making them look bigger than they really were, or at least she thought so. More than the best orgasm she could remember having in her entire life. Minali struggled with the idea as she fought to catch her breath. Her throat hurt as if she'd screamed. I want to find out what you taste like, detective, he said, ducking under the water before she could tell him to use her name. His hands pulled her legs apart with a gentle pressure she couldn't help but yield to. His hair was soft against her thighs for a moment before she realized why his head was between her legs. No man had ever gone down on her before. No, surely he wouldn't. His tongue rasped across her lady bits before it slid inside. Minali gasped as his fingers joined his tongue, working in tandem to push her to the brink of another climax. She pleaded for release once more, but he teased her for longer this time, drawing out the moment until she cried out once more at an orgasm inarguably better than the first. Her cries had barely died away before his mouth was on her again, urging her body toward an unbelievable third release. Minali arched her back, her head resting on the edge of the pool, unable to resist the sensations this man gave her. Didn't he need to come up for air? He must have been under the water for 4. She lost track of time as all she could focus on was the heat where he touched her, inside and out, and the building. This time she screamed his name, tangling her fingers in his hair as he gave her exactly what he'd promised, pleasures she hadn't dreamed of, because she'd never believed a man could do such things, let alone with just his hands and his mouth. Why she hadn't even touched him, when not long ago she'd been wondering what that hard length would feel like inside her. His fingers speared inside her, and she squirmed, wanting something bigger and longer. "Sven, stop," she gasped out, feeling the pressure build under his expert caresses. I want. His head surfaced, though his fingers did not. "What do you want, detective? Tell me. I'm yours to command." She groaned as he hit a particularly sensitive spot that sent sparks of pleasure shooting through her. He knew it too, she decided, holding his gaze as he watched her reaction to his touch. "I want more," she finally managed to say, before she gasped as his fingers changed to an even better angle, stealing her ability to speak. "I will give you more. Everything I promised," Sven said, his fingers working faster. Minali's world exploded under his touch once more, and through it she heard him chuckle. Arrogant merman, she thought, though she couldn't seem to catch her breath to get the words out. Instead, she let action speak for her. She pushed him with all her strength, so that he fell backwards on his butt. Before he could recover, she climbed on top of him, hissing with pleasure as she felt his tip enter her. Long and hard, and Minali moaned as he understood what she wanted and thrust deep inside her, filling her exactly like she wanted. She moved her hips, squeezing him as she rocked against him. This time he groaned. "Stars, detective, but it's been a long time since I've been with a woman. If you keep doing that, I won't last long enough to Despite his words, Sven still managed to give her the most massive orgasm of the lot before he succumbed to his own pleasure, delightfully deep inside her. He laid his head against her breast, still heaving with how hard she was panting. "Detective, they might say men are the best lovers, but I would choose you over a mere woman any day after that." He straightened so that he could meet her eyes. "With your permission, I would like to kiss you." Minali tried and failed to smother a laugh. "We've just had sex. Incredible sex. I can't believe we haven't kissed. Normally that comes first." Sven shook his head, his expression grave. "Not among my kind. A kiss can silence a siren, if for only a moment. To take her greatest weapon from her, to ask for her trust for even a moment while she is defenseless, I've never been that brave. But for you, I would take the risk." Minali was lost for words. The way he touched her told her he was an expert at lovemaking, and his lips definitely knew their way around a woman's body. Yet he'd never been kissed before. Something she'd heard a long time ago about prostitutes charging more for kisses than for sex ran through her mind. Human prostitutes, not Titan. Kissing was personal to humans too. Minali moistened her lips as she climbed out of Sven's lap, feeling a rush of cool water flood her lady bits as he slid out of her. 4 orgasms. He'd given her 4 of the best of her life. How could she begrudge him a simple kiss? "You have my permission," she said, before he sealed her lips with a kiss. Sven had been kissed by other women before, but none of them compared to the sweet little detective, whose body had twined around his only moments before. The heat of her, the taste of her, all of it drove him completely wild like no other woman he'd ever known. His dreams of Ali paled in comparison to the reality of the woman in his arms now. Who now expected him to kiss her. Scared to tell her that he'd never initiated a kiss before, he drew in a deep breath before touching his lips to hers. soft and salty from the water in the pool, and yet as sweet as the rest of her tasted too. Her lips parted, allowing him entrance, and he could not refuse her invitation. His hand trembled as he cupped the back of her head, deepening the kiss as his tongue twined with hers. Long he kissed her, wishing it would never end. The rest of their bodies might have joined, but this seemed more intimate somehow, the intermingling of breath as he stared into her eyes and knew she was the only woman he wanted. His body stiffened at the thought of her. Of having her again, and tomorrow and the next day, and… Sven squeezed his eyes shut. He needed to clear his name. He had nothing to offer her if tomorrow he lived inside a prison cell. Yet his body wanted to feel her wrapped around him again, moaning his name as he gave back every bit as much pleasure as he received. "Detective, I am at your service. Anything you want from me, name it," he said. "Minali," she said. "My name is Minali. I'm not working right now and you've seen me naked. Call me Minali." "Sweet Minali, thank you," he said, savoring the taste of her name on his tongue. Next time, if there was a next time, he wanted to shout her name the way she had his when she reached her climax. "No thank you," she said, blushing. "I've never had quite such a good time with a man before. It's almost a pity that it couldn't last for longer. Perhaps tomorrow evening when you've recovered we could." Her voice ended in a gasp. Sven followed her gaze to his lap. For the first time in his life, he wanted to cover his erection. "I apologize, Minali. Kissing you invigorated my body so much that it's eager to pleasure you again. As you say, tomorrow evening perhaps?" The exquisite warmth of Minali's hand closed around him. "I have all day. How many times do you think we could? Sven struggled to find the words as her hand began to stroke him. "Sex. No, 6, he corrected himself, not caring what he said as long as she didn't stop. She climbed back into his lap, and the slick heat of her enveloped him completely, driving all other thoughts out of his head. 8 times Minali's thoughts repeated all the way home and all the way to work the next day as she staggered around on legs turned to lead once she left the water. Her thighs ached, her lady bits ached, her breasts ached, and her lips felt bruised from all the kissing she and Sven had done in his private pool until they'd fallen asleep in each other's arms later on that evening. He truly was Poseidon, the god of the sea. If she saw him again now, she'd find it hard to resist ripping his clothes off so she could do it all over again. She'd found the perfect man, and she didn't care one jot that he was a titan or a merman. Sven was everything she'd ever wanted in a man. The moment Violet saw her, the succubus had let out a low whistle. "Wow, you sure got some action. Sven will be heartbroken. Did you get his name and phone number, or did you screw his dick right off?" Minali frowned. "I never treat my partners badly." Not that she'd had many. Including her ex-husband and Phil, she could count them on the fingers of one hand. And in her first 5 minutes in Sven's arms, he demonstrated he was more man than all of the rest put together. Violet grinned. "Me neither. I just skim a little off the top, so to speak." For a moment, Minali had forgotten her partner was a succubus. "What I do when I'm off duty is my own business," she said stiffly. "Oh, and I found out about our Jane Doe. She's a corporeal naiad, and her name is Belina." "Source?" Violet asked briskly. When Minali didn't reply, Violet concluded, "Right. The mystery man who's walking like you because you almost screwed his dick off. Got it." Minali failed to hide her blush, and Violet laughed. "We'd better get to work. That surveillance footage won't search itself," Minali said. The hours dragged in a haze of coffee and blurry video footage. The only advantage of sitting around doing such a dull task was that parts of her body had finally stopped aching for Sven. Minali rubbed her eyes, sick of staring at a screen. But if she didn't do this, who would? Violet and Doug the dog had each taken a desk and a snippet of surveillance footage. For 3 days, they'd tried to match the faces of those entering the fuzzy footage zone with those who left the zone before Bellina's murder. Anyone who'd remained in their zone during the time of the murder was either a suspect, or better yet a witness. Minali's list was depressingly small. Even Sven's doppelganger had managed to get crossed off the list when he'd appeared in an aircar on the edge of Metropolis, that he'd boarded inside the fuzzy zone well before Bellina's death. That left her with 2 men and a woman, all of whom had walked into the fuzzy zone and remained there long enough to commit or witness the murder, before walking out again at a spot where the surveillance cameras were unaffected by the naiad. Was it a coincidence that her 3 were all human? Not that she was complaining. Violet could keep the Titan suspects and witnesses if she wanted. Minali had had enough of weird this week already. She wanted to class Sven as part of that too, but something held her back. He'd been too wonderful to be considered anything but the highlight of her week. Maybe she should stop by his shop and see if he was free to meet up after work. That would give her something to look forward to, if she came up with nothing after speaking to her 3 possible people. She'd had Doug run her people through the colony database, so she had names and profiles to go with the faces. Addresses too. She lined up the 3 ID photos on her tablet screen. Why had these 3 people been hurrying away from the bar so late at night? No matter how long she looked at them, Minali's eyes were drawn to the woman more than the men. Most murders were committed by men, she knew, though women were just as capable of killing. Take Ali for example. Not that this woman looked like Ali. She had curly red hair, a rarity among the human population, and she worked at the Moon and Sixpence. She'd left the bar before closing time, but not all shifts ended when a place closed. And then she'd walked in the opposite direction to her home in the Arbor Dome, without boarding any kind of transport, when all the shops and things were shut for the night. There was something off about this woman, Minali's detective senses told her, though she didn't know what. Perhaps she was just imagining things, Minali told herself. This Rhiannon might have had a perfectly good reason to walk the way she did. She might have been picking someone or something up, or meeting someone before she went home. Walking through Metropolis at night, with a murderer on the loose, surely the woman had been watchful. She'd have seen every suspicious stranger, assessing the danger each man represented as she hurried past. The same as Minali or any woman on her own would have done. That's why she had to speak to this woman first, Minali decided. If anyone had seen something relevant to the murder, it was Rhiannon. Minali rose to her feet. Time to go visiting, she said. Violet checked the time. If you say so. The call for witnesses should be all over the news by now. The media release went out an hour ago. Did you see the headlines? They're calling the culprit the fish killer. She sniggered. Minali would never understand journalists and their need to give everything nicknames. Wonderful. So all our witnesses will be too busy laughing at the funny name to take me seriously. Wish me luck. Good luck. I'll head out in a few minutes too. I'll let you know if I find anything, Violet called after her. Minali started her speeder, and had to consider a moment before she dialed up a destination. Sure, she'd go see the redhead first, but at work or home? The girl worked in a bar, so it was anyone's guess what time her shift today would be, or whether it was her day off. The bar first, Minali decided. Then she could swing by Sven's shop and invite him to spend some time with her this evening. The speeder zipped off. That's all done, Mr. Grun, said the cheerful glazier. The tank's sealed and waterproof. Good as new, or maybe even better. Just make sure you don't get any more murderers in here, and you should be right. Sven forced out a smile. If he could have managed not to let the first murderer into his shop, life would be much easier. Sure, he hadn't been kicked out of the mare habitat yet, but he'd heard nothing from Minali in 3 days, and there was a distinct chilliness in the mare habitat, now that news article had come out about the murders. He could see the other mayor eyeing him, trying to work out if he'd killed the girl or not. Not he'd wanted to shout at them, but no one would have listened. He knew mayor were as independent as cats, wrangling them was a full-time job even without a murder to stir them up. "So I can fill the tank with water again?" Sven asked. He might not be able to do much about murderers, but at least he could put the crabs back where they belonged. "Sure thing, Mr. Grun. If you spot any leaks, call me and I'll be right over to fix them." Sven nodded as he transferred the credits to pay for the tank repairs. He wished the glazier a good day and waved as the doors closed behind him. It was a quiet day in the shop, so he turned on the water and headed to the back to fetch some of the crabs from the temporary holding tank he'd had to keep them in. Being back in the bigger tank meant they'd fight less and lose fewer claws. Less damage to the merchandise meant more credits for the crabs. Sven smiled to himself. He might not be much good at politics, but he did have a decent head for business. Who'd have thought a mayor might be good at making money? Something to consider when he got out of the colony. Some mermen had lived on land back on Tito, so it wasn't like he was breaking with tradition. Fish farming was all good and well, but if he could sell the excess to the rest of the system. Maybe he could even see Minali again if he spent time on the human planets as well as the Titan ones. He'd travel the system just for her alone. Lost in his daydream, Sven didn't notice that the tub he was loading the crabs into had tilted, and they were climbing out faster than he could pile them in. At least, he didn't notice until one decided to take an experimental nip at his foot. Swaying, Sven realized what had happened. The floor was now covered with crabs, and some of them had escaped to the front of the shop. He caught about a dozen, dumping them in the tank, before heading back for more. It took him the better part of 20 minutes to coax the last two out from under a cabinet. It would have taken him longer if he hadn't come up with the idea of camouflaging his hands to match the floor, so the crabs didn't see them until he pounced. He surveyed the back room, where the only remaining claws were waving in the holding tank. Good. Time to sort out the front of the shop. Most of them hadn't gotten much further than the doorway, so they were easy to catch, but one particularly stubborn beast had wedged itself under the counter. A claw the size of a woman's hand waved warningly at him. Sven had no intention of being outsmarted by a crustacean, even if the bastard could crush his hand in its claw. He was the ranking marine life on this planet, at least for the moment, and he wouldn't be defeated by a meal on legs. Extending the mottled green up his arms, he reached under the counter. His fingers closed on the back of the creature's carapace, and he dragged it out. Sven didn't hear the door hiss open, or the customer who entered. "You're going back in the holding tank by yourself. And I'm discounting you to half price. See if you survive the day, you bastard," Sven told the crab. A female gasp made him realize he wasn't alone. "Good afternoon, miss. How can I help you? Fancy a half-price crab?" Sven asked cheerfully. The woman's face turned deathly pale as she stared at the crab. No, at Sven's hands he realized, which were still green-skinned to the elbows. He excused himself and changed them back to brown. "Sorry miss, I forgot," he said. Her face went from pale to almost as red as her hair as she hissed, "You're another one of those things. Pretending to be human, taking away jobs and partners from decent humans who deserve them. You don't deserve to live." She lunged across the counter at Sven. While the speeder headed to the Moon and Sixpence, Minali pulled up more details on her woman. Her name was Rhiannon Rash, a 32-year-old bartender and sometimes cook from Elysium. No family. Her parents had died early on in the war, but both she and her brother had survived it. The brother, Herman, his name had been. Herman had died in the terrorist bombing of the Elysium law courts, shortly after the war ended. Both names were familiar, for the same reason. Minali hadn't investigated the bombings personally, but she had known the team who had. The media had quickly picked up the story that it was some sort of Titan vigilante, a suggestion put out by a very vocal group of human isolationists, who called themselves the Humans First Party. The culprits had never officially been identified, but Minali knew they'd narrowed the list down to less than half a dozen suspects, all of whom were humans who had died in the blast. Any or all of them could have been the suicide bomber. The explosion that had ripped the building apart had been caused by more C4 than one person could carry. Herman Rasch had been one of those suspects, she was sure of it. Minali skimmed the rest of Rhiannon's file, looking for any further references to her brother or Humans First. She found neither, but what she did find intrigued her. During the treaty negotiations, there had been numerous peace rallies in all the major cities. Not everyone wanted peace though, and some of the rallies had turned violent when pro-war advocates had waded into the rally, throwing punches and tearing up banners. Rhiannon had been one of those arrested at such a rally, though the profile never said what side she'd been on. Merely that she'd broken a man's nose and been responsible for soft tissue damage to several others. Rhiannon liked to kick men in the balls, Minali translated. She liked the woman already. When Minali arrived at the pub, she had to take a deep breath before stepping inside. The smell of alcohol made her nauseous, it always had, but this had to be done. At the bar, she asked to speak to Rhiannon. "You're out of luck. You just missed her. She's not working today, but she came in to pick up her knives from the kitchen." "Cooks and their knives. I dunno. She said something about cooking up a seafood feast for her new boyfriend though, so you'll likely find her at home," the bartender said. Knives and fish. Something shifted uneasily in Minali's stomach, and she couldn't blame it on the beer the barman was pouring either. "Did she mention anything to you about what she was doing last Friday night?" Minali asked. The bartender frowned. "Friday nights she's usually in here cooking, so she can leave early to meet up with that boyfriend of hers. She talks about him a lot, but he never comes to see her at work." Rhiannon wouldn't be the first girl to invent an imaginary boyfriend to keep other suitors at bay, Minali knew, but this raised her hackles further. Rhiannon had left the bar alone on that fateful Friday, something no conscientious boyfriend should have allowed, and she'd returned home unaccompanied too. Most women didn't do that without some sort of death wish. Not something Minali wanted in a potential witness. She liked her witnesses alive, thank you. She thanked the bartender and climbed back onto her speeder for the short ride to Seafood Supply. Sven dropped the crab on the counter, where it decided the woman was the bigger threat, and went for her face. She shrank back, and only then did Sven see the glint of a knife in her hand. His blood ran cold. Had she been about to stab him? Saved by a crab, he reflected, failing to hide his grin. "You think it's funny, creature?" the woman hissed. "Funny that things like you killed my brother, or seduced my boyfriend away from me? You'll stop laughing when I'm done with you. I'll cut up your color-changing skin so badly, you'll only be red for the rest of your life." She rounded the counter and thrust the knife at him again. Sven backed away, but he didn't have far to go. Behind him was a floor-to-ceiling display tank, and on his right was a wall. Whichever way he went, she'd have him cornered. He might not know who she was, but he recognized the fierce look in her eyes. It was the same one Ali had worn when she told the Mayor Council she was going to war. Not even the council had dared oppose her. So what use was Sven, just one man against that sort of feminine fury? If she was a mayor, he'd be dead already. "Make it quick," he muttered, closing his eyes. His last thought was a desperate hope that Minali wouldn't be the one to deal with the investigation into his death, when it was all over. She had that other murder to solve. Not some merman who... "Wait, stop," he implored, holding his hands up. "If you kill me, my people will hunt you down. Don't do this." The woman barked out a laugh, slashing the knife through the air as though she liked to see the light glint off the blade. "There's a bad movie line if ever I heard one. You're not a person. None of your kind are. You're just pretending to be people. Sven slowly lowered his hands. I'm not pretending. I'm only being me. I sell fish. I've never killed anyone or seduced anyone. He swallowed, thinking of Minali. The only time he'd ever succeeded at seducing anyone, and he'd done such a good job of it, that she hadn't even bothered to call him afterward. At least they'd had one perfect day together. I'm harmless really, he finished lamely. The door hissed open, and the voice Sven had dreamed of hearing for the last 3 days made him forget everything else. Sven, I was wondering if, Minali began. The woman moved more quickly than Sven would have believed possible. She shoved her body behind his, reaching under his arm to set the sharp blade to his throat. Her other hand gripped his shoulder. One move and I'll kill him, she hissed. Minali hesitated outside Seafood Supply. She'd never asked a guy on a date before, and during the short drive she'd grown increasingly nervous about it. Perhaps she should wait until after she was done with the interviews. Because if Sven rejected her, she wouldn't be able to keep her mind on the job. She'd spend all her powers of deduction trying to work out why, instead of using all her skills of observation to decide whether she had a potential witness, and what they weren't telling her. She wavered, but somehow she'd come close enough to the shop door to trigger the sensor, so the doors hissed open. Now she had no choice. Dreading Sven's response, she made herself walk inside. Forcing her voice to sound casual, she began, Sven, I was wondering if... A strange sound made her lift her eyes to his face instead of staring at her boots. A flash of fire as someone dived behind Sven before a distinctly female voice said, one move and I'll kill him. A flash of silver just above Sven's collarbone drew Minali's eyes to a knife. A kitchen knife, the sort you'd use to carve a roast. Not the normal weapon of an armed robber. In Sven's place, Minali would have brought her elbow down, dragging the woman's arm away from her throat, and she'd have grabbed the woman's hand with both of hers in order to make her drop her weapon. Disarmed, it would have been the work of barely a moment to pin the woman against the wall or the floor and handcuff her. Easy. But Sven just stood there, horror widening his eyes as the blade scraped against his skin, drawing blood. You should leave, detective. I don't want you to see this. Minali saw the defeat in his eyes. He believed he was about to die. She pulled out her stunner, looking for some way to aim it at the woman, but Sven's size made him an amazing human shield. Titan shield. Whatever. Sven, move away from her, Minali ordered, tightening her grip on her weapon. Either of you move and I'll kill him, the woman screeched. Minali glimpsed fire again and realization dawned. It doesn't have to be this way, Rhiannon. Just because the girl's body was found here, doesn't make Sven here the murderer. I can assure you he's a kind, upstanding citizen who would never hurt. Why would this thing hurt its own kind? She was the same as him, a creature pretending to be a person. She deserved to die. It was so easy, like she knew it too. Killing this thing will be even easier. Titans don't bleed red like us humans. Killing this one will be a mercy. She pressed the blade harder against Sven's neck, and a trickle of blood flowed down into his shirt. Despite the woman's words, the blood was as red as any human's. But from where she stood, she couldn't see it. Minali's eyes gazed into Sven's, and she fancied she could read his mind. For all his size and strength, Sven wasn't going to fight back. Like every battered woman Minali had ever known, he would submit to the abuse. And Minali couldn't allow it. No, please don't do this, Minali begged. Don't you see? If he was going to hurt you, he would have by now. Any other man would grab the knife off you and turn it on you. It doesn't matter what he is. Just because he's a Titan doesn't change that he's a good man. Sven closed his eyes. Killing is always easier after the first time. My people know this. That's why we don't. Shut up, creature. Rhiannon shouted. The first time even easier. Rhiannon had killed Belina. The thought hit Minali like a shuttle at full speed. Why did you kill the girl? Minali asked softly. She wasn't a girl. She was a thing pretending to be a girl so she could steal my boyfriend. I pushed her into the tank and held her down. She didn't even fight me. Like she knew she deserved to die. No bruises. No defensive wounds. No signs of rape. A woman walking alone at night, because she thought she was untouchable after she'd killed. And if Minali didn't do something, Sven would be her next victim. Her eyes met his, begging him to fight. He was the only good man in the Alton system, perhaps even the universe. Who cared if he wasn't human? Minali didn't. She only cared that she loved him. The rest of the universe could go space themselves. If you kill him, you won't walk out of here alive. I promise you that, Minali said. Put down the knife. She edged to the side, hoping to put Rhiannon within range of her stunner. Inch by inch she could almost see the woman's face. Not before this thing is dead. The door to the shop hissed open, and the strains of someone singing drifted through from the street. It was such an incongruously cheerful tune. Minali tried to turn her head to snap at the singer to shut up, but she couldn't move. Somehow she'd frozen in place. From the looks on Sven and Rhiannon's faces, Minali judged that they were similarly affected. Her thoughts whirled. Nothing a Titan could do should be able to get through her implant to incapacitate her like this. Was this some new kind of weapon, or a Titan ability no one knew about? To Minali's horror, someone stepped into the shop. Ali's bright smile and clinking toolbag were even more out of place than the song she stopped singing the moment the door slid shut behind her. This doesn't look good, she remarked, as if surveying nothing more worrying than a blocked toilet. I got an alert from the building management system that there might be a bit of trouble here. Cole said it was the sort of trouble that required my services. She set her bag down on the floor, freeing up her hands. To kill, Minali was sure of it. Minali wanted to scream at her to stop and leave this case to the professionals, but not even the muscles in her throat worked to allow her to speak. Sven, step away from her, Ali said calmly. Sven twisted out of Rhiannon's grasp, wincing as the blade of the knife scraped against his skin. He moved to Minali's side, facing Rhiannon. Now Minali could see the woman, but she was unable to take the shot that would save her life. Have you taken a life in this place before? Ali asked Rhiannon. You may nod or shake your head. With considerable effort, the woman nodded once, her red curls bobbing. Did you threaten his life too? Ali continued. She nodded again. Ali, please, Sven began. Sven knew what Ali was. What she would do. He didn't want this, either. Even as blood flowed down his neck from the shallow cut, he still wanted to save her. He was a genuine saint. If he and Minali survived this, she intended to marry the man. Ali ignored him. You don't deserve to live, she told Rhiannon. Rhiannon's eyes widened as the blade that was still coated with Sven's blood began inexorably to move toward her own breast. Her hand twisted, angling down with infinite slowness as only Rhiannon's eyes revealed her horror. Then the knife punched expertly between her ribs and a wordless cry left her lips before she withdrew the knife and tossed it on the floor at her feet. Seconds ticked by, though it felt like an eternity. Finally Rhiannon fell, lifeless to the tiles. Minali's heart sank as the door hissed open again. Hello, hello, hello. What's going on here then? Violet's familiar voice drawled as she strolled into the shop. An attempted murder which fortunately didn't succeed, and a suicide which did, Ali said. I think you'll find she's killed before too. She confessed to being the fish killer before she took her own life. Is that so? Violet mused. Sven rubbed his neck. Yes. Strange woman. Very sad. Minali looked from one mare to the other, then to Violet. All titans, not a human among them. If she disagreed, would they make her kill herself too? As if reading her mind, Violet asked, "Is that the way it happened, partner?" Minali attempted to moisten her mouth. To her surprise, she could move again. Several swallows later, she managed to say, "I came into the shop and found her threatening Sven with a knife. I drew my stunner, but she used this civilian as a shield, so I couldn't fire." She confessed like Ali said and then turned the knife on herself. Minali gritted her teeth. She wouldn't let the mayor get away with murder without tipping off Violet somehow. Overcome by grief and guilt most likely, Violet finished for her with a warning tone. Killing one person and then trying to kill a mayor. Not many can overcome their guilt. She wasn't the first and probably won't be the last. Violet knelt down and touched Rhiannon's neck, then placed a hand in front of her lips. No pulse, no breath. Dead. I'll call an ambulance to come get the body. Better scan her ID too, so I get the name right in my report. She leaned over Rhiannon's chip for a moment before straightening. I'll write this one up. You're off duty as of 5 minutes ago, Violet said to Minali. And overdue for a few days off. Time you took them. Minali wanted to protest, but Sven's hand closed around her arm in warning, so she subsided. Violet wrote notes and Ali left before anyone else arrived. While other watch and medical personnel came and went, Minali stood silently by, watching and waiting until finally she stood alone with Sven. The man she loved, who'd almost died. She took a deep breath. This is all your fault. Sven's heart sank. She was right, and he knew it. I'm a poor leader, and I didn't catch her until she almost struck again. I should have saved her, done something, but... Why didn't you fight back? Minali shouted. You're twice her size. You could have knocked her out with one blow and I'd be taking a live suspect to the holding cells instead of a corpse to the morgue. Sven hung his head. I couldn't hurt her, he whispered. Even though I knew what would happen, I couldn't bring myself to strike her. To strike either of them. It's not in my nature. Minali stared at him for a long, long time. Finally, she let out what sounded like a forced laugh. You're the last good man left, Sven, you know that? The only one I've ever met who wouldn't hit a woman even to save his own life, or someone else's. And I almost lost you because of it, you noble idiot. I'm going to teach you some basic self-defense moves, starting tomorrow, so if this ever happens again, you'll know how to pin someone without having to hurt anyone. I can't believe you nearly died. And I couldn't take a shot without hitting you because she was half your size. Whatever you want, Sven said. She'd saved his life walking in when she did. If Minali hadn't distracted the woman, Ali would have been avenging his death, and not just an attempt to kill him. You saved my life, so I owe you everything. Anything. Name it. If I had my way, I'd take you to a private pool and show you all the pleasures a body can take, though it will take me all night and day to do it. The only thing going through my mind the whole time was you, and how I wished I could tell you I loved you before she killed me. Minali's eyes grew round, and Sven regretted his words. Too much truth too fast. He'd never understand humans. He'd screwed up again, and she wouldn't forgive him this time. A pool, Minali said finally. You want to take me halfway across the colony before we can have thank fuck we didn't die sex, when there's a perfectly good counter here? And walls aplenty? There must be a dozen beds closer than a bloody pool. The counter? Sven stared at it like he'd never seen one before. Well, he'd never imagined having sex on one, but now she mentioned it. Humans have sex on counters? Minali just got more perfect every moment he was with her. Sven lifted her effortlessly onto the shop counter, his mouth glued to Minali's. She squirmed out of her uniform pants and underwear, then yanked her top off to add it to the pile. Her bra took only a moment longer, leaving her free to tackle Sven's clothing. Sven wasn't having it though. He kissed his way down her neck, her breasts and her belly until he knelt between her dangling feet. His eyes met hers for a moment before he flashed her a cheeky grin and buried his face between her thighs. "Stars, Sven," she cried, arching her back as he licked and sucked her into a frenzy of desire. Her orgasm burst over her like a sky full of shooting stars, and she didn't care who heard her scream. "I could spend all night watching you come like this," Sven said dreamily. "And not satisfy himself at all?" The thought stayed in Minali's mind for only a moment, before she reminded herself that this was Sven. He meant every word. "If you want, then one night we will," she said instead, then smiled as an idea struck her. "And afterwards, at dawn, I'll give you the best blowjob you ever had." His eyes lit up. Really? Anyone would think the man had never received a blowjob before. Minali almost laughed, then remembered the comment he'd made about why mermaids didn't kiss. If they rarely kissed because it kept their mouth busy, blowjobs must be rare indeed. "Yes. Tomorrow night," she promised. She was due some time off by the stars, and she was going to spend it with Sven. Naked. "You're wearing too many clothes," she grumbled, sliding off the counter. She helped him out of his pants while he tugged off his shirt. No underwear on her merman, Minali thought admiringly as she surveyed his naked glory. Every hard inch of him. "Stars, Sven," she said again, hooking one leg around his hips so she could rub against him. "Are you always this nervous around women?" He grinned, sliding his hands under her butt and lifting her so that when she next rubbed against him it hit all the right spots. Minali couldn't help letting out a moan of pleasure. Stars, the man wasn't even inside her yet, and he was going to make her come again. "Only the ones I love," he whispered. With one smooth stroke he entered her. Minali wrapped both legs around him now, pushing him in deeper. Now it was Sven's turn to moan. He turned and pushed her up against the wall, pinning her in place as he thrust slowly into her again. Hard and slow and deep, like he wanted to do this forever. His green eyes drank in her face, her body and every moan of pleasure that left her lips as her climax built. She clenched down on him as she came, shouting his name, and her own cries had barely died away before he gasped out her name with the awe of a man experiencing his first orgasm. "So you like doing it up against the wall?" she teased him. "Stars, yes," he gasped, still breathless. "Wait until you've tried a bed, and in the shower," Minali continued. "Your bed?" he ventured, looking hopeful. Minali unhooked her legs from around his hips and slid down to the floor. "Beds weren't as hard as walls. If you're half as good in bed as you are everywhere else, I might have to break out the handcuffs," she said. "Because once I have you in my bed, I don't think I'll want you to leave." He grinned. "Sounds great to me." She eyed his perfectly shaped butt, as he padded over to the wash basin to clean himself up. "Get some clothes on, and I can have us at my place in 10 minutes. My speeder's outside." In record time she mounted the speeder and felt Sven's hard body settle in behind her. He wrapped his arms around her torso and leaned forward. "I never want to let you go." There was such yearning in his tone it made Minali's heart ache. She relaxed in his embrace. Most men were bastards, but she'd stumbled across a good one. A titan and a merman too, but most of all, a good man. "You won't have to," she promised. "You're the only man in the galaxy I'll ever want, fishtail." In the heart of the water cascading into a fish tank, the spark of a naiad spirit beamed. Sven deserved some happiness after being lonely for so long. She was delighted that she'd been instrumental in bringing it about, even if she'd had to die to do it. But naiads couldn't truly die, even if their temporary corporeal forms did. Belina drank the thin trickle of energy from the water swirling in the tank. Her recovery would be slow, but she would soon be back to her full power. Next time, when she took corporeal form, she would do it properly. And when she next saw him, she wanted more than a kiss. This has been Poseidon, an alien sci-fi romance. Book 2 in the Colony Aqua series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.